This week I'm going to show you my top 10 DIY tips and tricks, the sort of things that I use all the time and are genuinely useful for doing DIY around the home, unlike those DIY hacks you see on the internet, which are just stupid and dangerous. You're never too old to learn, and I must say I've been really lucky over the years to pick up lots of tips and tricks watching professionals and tradesmen work. And I always find it fascinating that just when you think you know everything about a subject, there's always something else that you can learn. So today is my top 10 tips and tricks, and although I'm sure you would have seen some of these before, that's probably going to be different for different people, and I know there's one or two things in there that I guarantee you haven't seen before. So let's start with a little bit of measuring and the humble tape measure, and measuring from the end of a bit of timber with this wobbly thing, which we all know what it's for, and it's easy to measure from a fixed end like this. But when it comes to measuring from a line or a screw head or something on a flat plane, this slidey bit really does get in the way. And it means that you can end up with something that's not quite as accurate as it should be, which isn't any good if you want an accurate measurement. So something I learned on a surveying course many years ago is rather than trying to measure with this wobbly bit here, just come in to an even number, I would say 100 millimeters or maybe 4 inches if you're working in that, and then put that on the line, which means that you can actually fix it really accurately. Then you can measure or mark the other end, but you do have to remember to add that 100 millimeters back in, or 4 inches, or whatever you're going to use, just as a double check. When I use this method, I must say the last thing I just do is very roughly put the slidey thing on the end and just double check that I've got the right measurement, because if you forget to take off that bit that you've added in to start with, you're going to be miles out. Right, number 2, measuring an internal dimension, and this could be within a cabinet or a box, or within a window frame, for instance, if you're trying to measure for a blind accurately. And traditionally we all put the tape measure in one end and measure the best we can in the other, which may give you a measurement to within plus or minus 1 or 2 millimeters. But if you're measuring, let's say for blinds for instance, you really want to get it as accurate as possible, or if you're trying to get a bit of timber to fit snugly in these, you really want to be millimeter perfect. So the best way of measuring something like this, like an internal, is to do it in 2 halves, and I'll show you. So the first half, just measure a round number. I'm going to pick 300 millimeters and just put a mark here. Although this is a carpenter's pencil, I've sharpened it to a fairly good point. And then secondly, we can measure from this point up to that mark, which I'm getting as 267. So that's 300 plus 267. So that makes 567. So to double check, we can do it the traditional way and just roughly do it. So I would say that that is 565. So I'd have been maybe 2 millimeters out, which wouldn't have been the end of the world if I was measuring for blinds. But if I'm trying to cut a piece of timber snugly for this gap, I'd have maybe cut it 2 millimeters short to start with. It does mean you do have to mark the piece. And if you're working with like a windowsill where you don't want to put a mark, then just get a bit of painter's tape, put it on the piece and mark the painter's tape. Then you can take it off. Job done. So the scenario is we have to drill a pilot hole in exactly the right place to accept a screw. And I'm just using a hinge here as an example. Very easy if you've got a self-centering bit, but most people don't have self-centering bit. So traditionally the best way of doing it is putting it in place, then getting a very fine pen or pencil. We're going to aim at this middle one here. Mark in a circle, and that's exactly where we want to drill our pilot hole. But you know, as usual, things aren't always as easy as they look, and quite often you can start drilling a hole and it just goes off center. Let me just give you an example. If I aim here, so I've just gone 1, maybe 2 millimeters into this, and it's clear that I'm not on center. The grain has maybe pushed me to one side, and however hard I tried to hit the center, it just didn't work. But fear not, there's a solution, and it's fairly easy. All you do before you drill too far is angle your drill bit at the center and drill a little bit deeper. And then with it running, just bring it straight and it should come back to central. So by aiming the drill bit into the centre at an angle, drilling further in and then straightening up, being careful not to break the drill bit, we've managed to persuade that hole to be centred. So when we put our hinge back on, everything is looking rather nice. So we've got our traditional string line that we can use for 101 things, either in the workshop or outside, construction, gardening or whatever. And we need to keep it nice and tie it off on whatever pin you're working on. Now, one thing I used to do was sort of double it over and end up doing a couple of sort of knots like this, which is okay until you have to take the thing off. Then it all starts getting a bit messy. So let's just set this up again, pull this nice and tight. As I wind this round, I can actually wind it on top of what I've already done, which definitely helps, but you can't just leave it like that, else the things are going to fall apart. So the trick is, with the string line itself, you bring this up and over the existing line, and now you can let go of this, and this is still really tight. And this isn't going anywhere because this tight line is holding it tight. And the best thing about this is once you've finished with it, it comes off really easily. All you need to do is pop that over and then this just comes off like a charm. And it doesn't matter what size line or stake you use. This could be a line in the garden and a stake that you've got while you're setting out some pathway or whatever, and just pull that over and it still works. Just like that. This is an excellent little tip that works perfectly and saves a lot of effort. So when you finish painting, either between coats or for the day, wrap up your roller and tray in a plastic bag, and this will stop it drying out and saves you having to clean it at the end of each day. In the same way, brushes can be wrapped up in plastic and will quite happily last days without drying out. I'm now covered in paint, so I'm going to clean up using one of these Ultra Grime wipes. They're not sponsoring me at all, I just think that they work incredibly well and remove any paint, grease or dirt effortlessly. Somehow they've got a rough side and a smooth side, and if you ever wonder how I clean my tools after getting them so dirty in the garden, well, now you know. I would highly recommend these wipes and they last for ages. I'll put an Amazon link to them in the description if you're interested in having a look. Fitting your own blinds is a very common DIY job, and using blinds rather than curtains is a very cost-effective way of fitting out a house, especially when you've got your first one and you're struggling to pay the mortgage. I've done a video all about how to fit blinds. I'll put a link to in the description below, and I've got a couple of top tips all about when you have to cut these down. Blinds like these come in standard widths, maybe 600, 900, 1200, and then you cut them down to suit the size of your opening. This one started at 600 and I took maybe 100mm off to make it fit the window that it's currently working on. So my top two tips for blinds are, rather than trying to work out how much fabric you need, just work out what gap you have and compare that to the blind that you've bought. So if you have a 500mm gap and you bought a 600mm wide blind, you just have to take off 100mm of material. You don't have to then worry about how wide the material is because you've got these plastic bits at each end. So all you need to do is work out what you need to take off rather than what you want to keep, and it will work out exactly. My second tip is that there's two ways of taking off this material. If you saw my video, one way of doing it is by laying out the blind, cutting with a pair of scissors, and this way creates a really clean edge and is probably the best quality way of doing it. But there is another way of doing it, which was recommended by a few viewers when that video went out, and I've tried it this way and it does actually work. Let me grab an offcut and I'll show you. So let's say I've worked out how much I need to take off, and that comes to, let's say, 75mm. So rather than working out how much fabric I need left, all I'm going to do is mark 75mm on here. I'm going to leave it rolled up, and I'm going to leave the aluminium centre in and any bars that are used with it. And all I'm going to do with this is cut it on the miter saw. So yes, you heard me right. I'm going to cut it on the miter saw here, just like a piece of timber. And it's not the cleanest of cuts. You do get some frayed edges, but what I found is you don't get that many. And the ones you do get are fairly easily tidied up using a pair of scissors afterwards. But what you do get is an incredibly quick way of cutting down your blind, and very accurate. It's millimetre accurate. You don't even need dust extraction. I make sure the blade is running at its highest RPM before I start the cut, and I take it fairly slowly as I go through both the fabric and the aluminium centre bar all at the same time. Any frayed edges I trim with scissors, and although this doesn't give a perfect result in terms of fabric, it's quite difficult to see once it's up, and it does ensure that the blind edge is straight by cutting it this way. So this next little tip I actually put to use a couple of videos ago when I put the gates on the fence out the back, but I didn't have time in the video to actually explain it. And this time, rather than making sure that our drill holes are exactly in the middle, I'm actually using a strategy on purpose to offset them slightly, to be able to adjust things a bit like this hinge that I've got here. Let me show you what I mean. So the first thing I'm going to do is to draw a fine outline of exactly where I want it around the perimeter. And then I'm going to mark out 2 holes, one at the top, one at the bottom, to fix my hinge to. Do a bit of a pilot hole. And this is exactly what happened off camera when I fitted my gates. That actually one of the holes was off centre and I just didn't spot it. Which means that when you actually screw it in, so I don't know if you can see there, but the whole thing has shifted about 1 millimetre or 1.5 millimetres to the right, because I've got these countersink type screws here, and because the hole is off centre, it then, in that final turn, pushes the whole hinge off centre as well. But there is a way of getting it back, and that is to use the 2 holes that you haven't drilled yet strategically to bring it back. Let me show you what I mean. So this has moved in this direction. So if I actually drill this hole off centre in this direction, back off that screw and then tighten this one up, I can actually persuade it to come towards me. So there's a pilot hole off centre towards me. If I just unloosen this, then I can actually put this one in. And in the last turn or two, it will come back to me. So you may see now that actually the hinge has gone too far to the left. I can actually see my line. But with a hole on the right and a hole on the left, now I can actually adjust this left and right by 1 or 2 millimetres, depending on which screw I tighten first and how much I tighten it. So if we want it back in the middle, I'll just back this off, tighten this one slightly, it will move back, maybe a little bit more. There we go. And then I can tighten this one. And then if I tighten both together, that isn't going to move, because the friction now between the hinge and the post is such that it's not going to move left and right. I can actually tighten those screws up. And if I have a quick look with my torch, now that is perfectly centered. For those of us that use circular saws guided by a straight edge, you quite often need to know the distance from the edge of the base plate to the blade to essentially offset the straight edge on purpose to cut in the right place. So to do that accurately, rather than trying to measure with a tape measure, set up some scrap timber and make a very short cut, which you can then measure, which is easier and more accurate. 29. So once you've done this, as long as you don't change the type of blade, the measurements will never change. So you can record them somewhere easy to find. 29 and 102. More and more people these days are putting up pictures and prints so the tops align exactly, which isn't necessarily the easiest thing to do because they all seem to have different lengths wires at the back, which means the hooks have to be in different places for the tops to align exactly. And there's an easy way of doing it, and it involves, first of all, putting up a print. I'm using the wall here, but maybe the best thing to do is to use a piece of timber. And then just marking a line on the surface at the top. And now I'm going to do exactly the same with my second print, which has a completely different length string. I'll just level it there and then put a mark. And now what we can do is measure the distance between both the tops of the prints, and that's the difference in the string. And if I start at 100 like I like to do, that is 158. So taking off the 100, that's 58 millimeters between these two. So if I want this one to be exactly level as the first, I have to put this 58 millimeters higher than this one. That is perfect. And the very last tip, if you're still using traditional fixings into plasterboard, which I'm not, I'm converted, I'm using these claw fixings, rather than using a masonry bit to drill through your plasterboard, which is essentially just cardboard and very light plaster, try using a brad pointed bit, which cuts a lot cleaner hole, which you'll appreciate when you have to fix it at some later date. And that goes in really tidy. I hope you enjoyed these tips and tricks. I think there was 12 or 13 in the end, so there's 2 or 3 extra for free. Remember, Patreon, subscribe, all that sort of stuff, and I will see you next time.